Hi, this is Stacey, and in this video I'm going to give a brief tutorial for SPSS. So, the first thing to know is that there are three types of files you'll typically work with in SPSS. The first is your data file, so that's what you're seeing here on the screen, and this is just a file that contains all the information about your data, as well as your data itself. So these are the responses that participants have put in on the survey. You'll also work with an output file. This opens up automatically whenever you open up an SPSS file, and this is what will contain your output, so the results of all the different analyses that you run. A third file that's very important is a syntax file. I strongly recommend always saving your syntax whenever you do things in SPSS. It's basically a way of saving the code that the program used to run different analyses or to do different things in SPSS. And the reason this is good is because once you familiarize yourself with syntax in SPSS, oftentimes it can be quicker to run analyses using syntax as opposed to the point-and-click method. Another reason is it's a nice way to keep a log of everything that you've done with the data file. And the third reason is because it can help you to more easily identify any errors that may have been made. So you can actually open up any one of these types of files just by going to File, New, and if you wanted to input some raw data by hand, you could open up a blank data file. You can also open up an empty syntax file, or you can open up an empty output file as well. Script files I have not really worked with before. Okay, whenever you run an analysis, you can always choose to do something called paste, and that will also open up a syntax file directly for you. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. Okay. So we've gone over the different types of files. The next important thing to know is that when you're in your data file, you'll notice that you have two tabs here in the bottom left-hand corner. That's the data view and the variable view. So the variable view is where you'll probably work a lot initially. So when you get your raw data and you want to start cleaning up a data file. And this has all of the information about the variables in your study, names for them, what they mean, any values and what those might mean, and so on and so forth. The data view, again, this is where you actually have the data that participants input when they took your survey. So, for example, up here you have different items on a particular scale. The scale is measuring disagreements. And here you can see you have a variety of numbers ranging from, looks like 1 to 5. So participants had an option of entering any number between a 1 and a 5 on a scale to answer these questions. Okay, and you'll see this is a pretty big data file. So they can put in numbers, they can also put in free responses, if that's something that you asked for in your survey, of course. Okay. All right. One of the first things you'll want to do when you get your raw data file is to actually name your variables. So you'll do that within variable view in your data file. And that's just in this column called name. These will usually be labeled something like Q1, Q2, Q3, and that ends up not being very helpful as you're going through and adding together scores for participants to create a scale score, and as you're working with different variables in your study. So all you have to do is simply type in whatever name you want here. So for example, this defaults to status, but I could also just call it response type if that would be more helpful. Okay. And so what that'll do, if you click back over to data view, you'll notice that your column name here has been changed to response type. The only other important thing to note here is that you can't have any spaces, so that's why all of the names here are together in this way and don't have any spaces in them. SPSS will not accept that. Okay. All right, the next column is type. And so this is pretty important sometimes because it sort of determines what type of input you have and sort of what you can choose over here in terms of the type of variable that you have. So if you just click on an example, you'll see you have a lot of different examples, but the most common ones are date, numeric, and strings. So just use date if you have data that is a date in that particular column. You'll want to use numeric whenever participants have input a number to respond to a survey item. So again, if they're answering questions on a scale of 1 to 7, you'll want to have that in numeric because that allows you then to have your measurement form be in scale and run your analyses properly. The other common one is string, and so that's more for like free response type questions if participants are typing in words. Okay, and you can see some of that here. Like most of these are numeric. You have string for questions when participants were asked to provide the email address of someone, right? Okay. Let's see. So width and decimals, we don't worry about that too much here. This is just the width of the column in data view, I believe. So you'll notice these are different widths, which I believe correspond to this. Decimals can be important if you want to show decimals in your data. So, for example, if I wanted these to be 2.0 instead of just a 2, I could go in here and make sure that the decimal places was to 1. Okay. In terms of the labels, so these end up being really helpful. When you download a raw data file, these should just transfer over from your survey. So these are typically the actual items that participants saw as they were filling out your survey, and this is really useful in helping you to determine what you should be naming your columns. So for example, this was probably originally named something like Q26, but because I looked at the label and I saw, oh, okay, this is the question where we said, what is your gender? I knew I could name this gender, okay? And it also helps you to identify like your measures. You can look here and see the text of your questions, and that helps you know kind of which measure each of the columns is referring to. All right. Then in terms of values, this should already, by default, just kind of already be set up for you in your data file. But if you needed to create a new variable for some reason, you might have to go in and make these. But for example, this shows you basically the scale that participants saw when they were responding to a survey item. So you can click on this one and see that participants saw a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 meaning not at all important to 5 being very important. Let me see if I can find an example of one I created. This was probably one. So we oftentimes have free response for religious spiritual affiliation and then go back in and recode those. So here I probably created this scale kind of based off of what I saw in the data. So you would just do that, for example, by typing in whatever value. Like we've already got 1 through 9 here. So let's just do 10. And let's call this label here, let's just make it something, let's do Wiccan, something like that, okay? And so you can see that that added that there. And so if you had any participants who identified as Wiccan, then that could just be easily recoded as a 10, and that makes it easier when you're running your demographic data, as I'm going to show in a moment, or in the next video rather. Okay, so the last important piece to kind of note in SPSS is this column here called measure. So what we will most often be using are these two, nominal and scale. You've probably reviewed these different types of measurement in one of your classes or in the lecture portion of this class, but basically you have several options. So scale, ordinal, and nominal. Scale, this is going to be for cases when you have, again, like a scale of 1 to 7. You'll want to make sure that it is in scale form. These don't always show up correctly when you download the raw data, so you'll want to check this. And the other one we use a lot is nominal. So this is more for when you have different categories. So for example, let's see, if we go to race. So this is going to be a particular category where they're not necessarily ordered. Like there's no reason why American Indian is a 1 and Latino, Latina is a 4. We just sort of randomly assign those. There's no order that really exists in the real world, right? So that's why this is nominal. Whereas, let's see, scroll on down. So again, going to one of our survey items, this does have meaning. So a 1 is strongly disagree, and then it increases, right, with the scale all the way up to 5, strongly agree. Okay? So again, this was just a brief tutorial of SPSS for those of you who may not have used it before, a little crash course. I hope this was helpful as we move to the next section.